So one side says BLM protests are peaceful. The other side says BLM protests are violent. Let's look at the facts. My name is Nathan Laurie. If you are new here, we talk about the law and the facts. If you're about that life, don't forget to like this video, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Okay, here are two headlines from the right. The Federalist study: up to 95% of the 2020 U.S. riots are linked to Black Lives Matter. CNN: about 93% of racial justice protests in the United States have been peaceful, a new report finds. Now, both these headlines are referring to the same study, the one you see on screen now. But today, you're going to judge who's got the best argument about whether BLM protests are peaceful or not. Now, you may have heard the arguments about BLM protests and whether they're peaceful or not, but what are the facts? I'm going to present to you both sides, and you're going to judge who has the better argument. So first, let's look at the study that both sides are going to point to in their argument. Now, this study is called Demonstrations and Political Violence in America, New Data for the Summer of 2020. This is by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. It's a government-funded research group that collects conflict data and provides detailed analysis and crisis mapping around the world. Now, this group doesn't just look at events in the United States, but also events around the world. The team leader is Dr. Rutabeth Kashish and her assistant, Sam Jones. Now, their work in this study and a subsequent follow-up study is cited by both right and left-wing sources. Here's Time Magazine, for instance. Here's CNN. Also on the right, you have the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist. But depending on what news you consume, you may have heard very different things about this research. Let's start with what the left or the liberal side is saying. Now, most of the left-wing sources are only pointing to the study's conclusion, which is that about 95% of protests within the United States between May 24th and August 22nd in the year 2020 were peaceful. They also report that fewer than 570, or about 5%, involves some type of violence. And about Black Lives Matter specifically, the study claims that more than 93% of all demonstrations connected with the Black Lives Matter movement were peaceful and nonviolent. Here is Time Magazine's headline: 93% of Black Lives Matter protests have been peaceful, the report finds. And as you can see here, they link you to the report. CNN: 93% of racial justice protests in the U.S. have been peaceful, a new report finds. And as you can see, they also link this same report. Now, it's also worth noting that demonstrations involving right-wing militias and militant social movements on the right have turned violent or destructive about twice as often as Black Lives Matter protests, or nearly, for context, 14% of the time, meaning that you're twice as likely to be involved in a violent protest on the right than you are on the left, according to the data. So now that you've heard the left's interpretation of the data, are you convinced? Now, before you click off this video, I challenge you to hear the other side's interpretation of this same data and see if you still are confident in your beliefs. The Federalist study: up to 95% of the 2020 riots are linked to Black Lives Matter. The Heritage Fund says, for 5 months, BLM protests trashed American cities. After the election, things may only get worse. And again, both these sources are pointing to the same study. So, right-leaning sources make it clear that they are not arguing with the data, but the interpretation of that data. They accept that 93% of all Black Lives Matter protests are peaceful. They also accept that 95% of all protests in the United States have been peaceful. But this is not the full story. See, the conservatives argue that we need to look at the numbers in context. They also make it very clear we should separate riots and protests, as they are two separate events. One, for instance, is criminal, while the other is not. Essentially, it's like looking at something that's legal, let's say like an MMA match, versus criminal assaults. They both have some elements that overlap, right? People are being hit, but one is a legal activity and the other is not. So you should look at them separately to try to get an understanding of the criminal aspect of it and not just protest in general. Like if I was to argue that 99% of all boxing matches are peaceful, that wouldn't stop us from evaluating an increase in criminal assaults that may also be occurring at the boxing matches. See, conservatives argue that they're more concerned with increasing criminal activity than people exercising their legal right to protest. So when it comes to this data about BLM, and when it comes to riots, riots are illegal. And that's what we want to focus on. So based on the data, riots have exploded in 2020, going from less than 100 per year to over 600 in the 3 months this study looked at. Here's another research group that says it clearly: a record year for civil unrest in the United States. Now, the Federalists dug into the data and reports this. Of the 633 incidents coded as riots in the data, 88% of riots involve Black Lives Matter activity. But that number is deceptive. The reason why is data from 51 incidents lacked information about the perpetrators' identities. Black Lives Matter activists were involved in actually 95%. Again, 95% of riots, which information about the perpetrator's affiliation could be obtained. So the conservative side looks at it differently. They're saying we're looking at crimes, criminal activity. And based on riots, which are crimes, we have between a 6 to 10-fold increase in the amount of riots. And when the perpetrator's affiliation is obtained, 95% of the time, they're associated with BLM. Now, for comparison, here is the amount of riots worldwide in 2018. It's about 350. And in the US, between May and August in 2020, 3 months, we had 633 in the United States alone. So in conclusion, the right wing argues that we have a huge riot problem, and that if you're at a riot, 95% of the time, it will be associated with Black Lives Matter. Now, the conclusion from the left is that BLM protests are mostly peaceful. 93% of the time, they're peaceful. And right-wing protests are not. But the right-wingers are going to counter. We have about a 6 to 10-fold increase in riots, and 95% of that increase, right? 95% of the time, when there's a riot, it's based on BLM. So now you've heard both sides of the argument. But who do you agree with? Do you believe that BLM protests are mostly peaceful, as said in Time magazine and in the study? Or do you believe that even though they're peaceful, there's still a problem with riots, right? A 6 to 10-fold increase in riots. And 95% of the time, if it's a riot, it's probably going to be associated with BLM. That's an issue. Let me know in the comment section which side you think presents the best context of the argument. And I'll see you next time. Peace.